Hi guys, tonight we begin a story that feels both mysterious and unsettling. In the lonely mountains of Wyoming, an astonishing discovery was made in the 1930s. A tiny human mummy, no taller than a newborn, yet preserved with features that seemed far too strange. Was it a child, an ancient burial, or something beyond explanation? Let's slowly unfold this mystery together. If you appreciate calm, reflective journeys through forgotten times, don't forget to tap like, subscribe, and share in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing where these stories are reaching. The story begins in the heart of the American West, during a time when prospectors still searched for gold and hidden treasures in remote places. Wyoming in the early 20th century was a land of rugged mountains, dry winds, and endless plains. A place where secrets could remain buried for centuries. Among the barren ridges of the Pedro Mountains, two men were chipping away at rocks in search of valuable minerals. Their tools echoed against stone, filling the quiet air with sharp metallic strikes. It was hard work, slow and exhausting, but they believed there might be fortune waiting for them beneath layers of ancient rock. On one particular day in October 1932, as their picks struck deeper into the mountainside, something unusual began to emerge. Instead of solid stone, a small hollow appeared. Like the entrance to a hidden chamber, dust filled the air as rocks collapsed, opening a tiny space just large enough for one of the men to crawl inside. What he found would mark the beginning of one of America's strangest archaeological mysteries. Inside the shallow cave, resting against the back wall, was a figure no taller than 18 inches. At first glance, it looked like a doll, or perhaps some trick of dried roots and stone, but as the men brushed away dust with trembling hands, they realized they were staring at something far more chilling. The withered remains of what appeared to be a very small human. The body was seated upright, legs crossed beneath it in a strange, almost meditative position. Its skin, though leathery and shrunken, clung tightly to its bones, and its face was preserved with uncanny detail. The forehead was low and sloping, the eyes closed in eternal rest, the nose flat, and the mouth seemed frozen with tiny sharp teeth visible between thin lips. The men, hardened by years of frontier labour, stood frozen in shock. This was no ordinary skeleton. It looked impossibly small, smaller than even the tiniest infant, yet its features were those of an adult. Legends among native tribes told of little people who lived in the mountains, beings of small stature with mysterious powers. Some said they were healers, others that they were dangerous tricksters. But the miners were not thinking about legends. They were staring at something real, something that seemed to confirm what old stories had whispered for generations. They carefully lifted the tiny mummy from its resting place, wrapping it to protect the fragile body. Word spread quickly through the nearby towns, and soon the Pedro Mountains mummy, as it came to be called, became the centre of fascination and debate. Was it a baby born with deformities, an ancient adult from a lost culture, or a carefully constructed hoax meant to trick the curious? Scientists, doctors, and skeptics would soon gather, each trying to solve the riddle of who or what this little figure truly was. As night fell over the Wyoming hills, the miners could not have known that their discovery would stir questions still unanswered nearly a century later. And so, our journey into this quiet but haunting mystery begins, one step at a time, through history, science, and the whispers of legend. When news of the strange little body spread, curiosity grew quickly. People from nearby towns travelled to catch a glimpse of what was being called the Pedro Mountains mummy. For many, it was almost impossible to believe until they saw it with their own eyes. The figure was so small, barely 1.5 feet tall, yet its features appeared fully formed, as though it had once been a living adult. It was not lying down like most mummies, but sitting upright with its legs folded and its arms resting on its lap. The leathery skin stretched over its bones, and its head seemed slightly tilted forward, as if frozen in quiet meditation. For those who gazed upon it, the image stirred both wonder and unease. Soon, doctors and scientists were invited to examine the tiny mummy. In Casper, Wyoming, specialists studied its proportions, its skull, and even its teeth. Some believed they were looking at a premature infant that had been preserved by natural conditions in the cave, yet there were details that did not fit. The teeth, for instance, were sharp and worn, more like those of an adult than a newborn. The skull seemed strangely shaped, with a sloping forehead that reminded some observers of primitive human ancestors. Photographs were taken, measurements were made, and debates grew louder. The mummy, only about 7 inches from head to seat, could not easily be explained. Native legends began to surface again. For generations, tribes such as the Shoshone and Crow had told of small people living in the mountains. They were said to be powerful, sometimes kind, sometimes mischievous, and always cloaked in mystery. Some tribes called them Nemeragar, describing them as little warriors who could shoot poisoned arrows and vanish into the rocks. When the miners discovered the mummy, many locals whispered that perhaps the old stories had been true all along. Was this tiny figure proof that the legendary little people had once lived in Wyoming? Skeptics, however, were not convinced. Some argued that the body was nothing more than a hoax, perhaps a carefully crafted doll, or a manipulated skeleton meant to fool people. But those who saw it in person found it difficult to dismiss. Its features were too precise, too lifelike. X-rays would later reveal bones inside the body, suggesting it was genuine. Still, the question remained, was it human or something else entirely? As the years passed, the Pedro Mountains mummy continued to be displayed and studied, moving from one owner to another. With each new examination, new theories appeared, yet none could provide a final answer. And so, the mystery deepened, leaving both science and legend circling around the same unanswered question. Who was the tiny mummy in the mountains of Wyoming? The scientists who examined the Pedro Mountains mummy were divided, and that division only added to the fascination surrounding it. Some medical experts insisted it was the body of an infant, perhaps one born prematurely centuries earlier. They argued that the strange features, such as the sharp teeth and the sloping skull, might have been the result of genetic abnormalities. Others, however, were struck by the possibility that the remains could belong to a fully grown adult of very small stature. In the 1930s, anthropology was still a developing science, and ideas about early human ancestors or unknown cultures stirred the imagination of the public. Newspapers eagerly reported on the mummy, printing photographs and describing its eerie details. Readers were fascinated by the idea that hidden in the mountains of Wyoming could be evidence of a forgotten race. The debate was not only scientific but cultural as well. Native American tribes felt a certain weight to the discovery. To them, it was not just a body but a reminder of stories passed down through countless generations. The tales of the Nemeragar had always described them as fierce little people, sometimes healers, sometimes warriors, who lived in the shadows of the mountains. Some elders claimed the mummy was a sign of respect, that these beings were real and should be remembered with caution. For others, it stirred fear, recalling warnings that encountering the Nemeragar could bring misfortune. Despite the mystery, the mummy was treated as a curiosity. It was placed on display in small exhibitions, drawing lines of curious onlookers who wanted to see the tiny body for themselves. People stood in front of the glass case staring at the figure that seemed both fragile and eternal. Children pressed their faces to the glass while their parents whispered about whether it was a miracle of preservation or some kind of trick. Over time, the body was even taken to different states, shown to researchers and the general public alike. Each time it was moved, new rumours seemed to follow. Some said it was shrinking, others that it gave off an unsettling feeling when viewed up close. A few even claimed that strange accidents befell those who handled it. While most dismissed these stories as superstitions, they added to the air of mystery surrounding the tiny mummy. By the late 1930s, scientists used X-ray technology to peer inside the body. What they saw only deepened the riddle. The skeleton appeared real, the spine curved, the skull fully developed, and the rib cage intact. The teeth were clearly visible, not like the soft gums of an infant, but hard and shaped like those of an adult. Yet the size, barely 1.5 feet tall, made no sense for a grown human. Was it a case of an unknown genetic disorder from centuries ago, preserved by accident in the dry cave air? Or was it evidence of something far older and more mysterious, a remnant of a race no one truly understood? These questions followed the mummy wherever it went, and as the story spread beyond Wyoming, it captured the imagination of people across the country. It was no longer just a local curiosity, it was becoming a national mystery. As the years moved forward, the tiny figure continued to draw attention. In towns across Wyoming and beyond, people spoke of the mummy as if it were a piece of living folklore. It was not unusual for travellers to pass through and ask about the little man of the mountains. The fascination was not only in the size, but in the way the body seemed so lifelike, as if at any moment it might stir from its long slumber. Scientists continued to debate the origin of the mummy, yet ordinary people simply wondered how such a thing could exist. Many believed it was proof of the Native American legends that had endured for centuries. Among the most famous stories was that of the Nemerigar, the mysterious race of small beings said to inhabit the hidden valleys and caves. Some of these tales described them as healers, with the ability to cure illnesses and guide hunters. Others described them as fierce warriors who would not hesitate to defend their territory. The discovery of the Pedro Mountains mummy seemed to match those tales in an uncanny way. The upright posture, the adult-like features, the strange presence. It all seemed to suggest that perhaps the legends were rooted in reality, yet the scientific community was divided. Anthropologists argued that the mummy could be explained through natural processes. They proposed that the dry cave had acted like a natural tomb, slowing decay and preserving the tiny body. The unusual features, they said, could be explained by rare medical conditions or developmental disorders. X-ray studies supported the idea that the body was genuine, but not necessarily extraordinary. However, those who believed in the legend argued differently. They pointed out that the mummy's teeth were not those of a child, that the skull shape did not match known deformities, and that the overall impression was one of an adult, not an infant. Newspapers fueled the mystery with dramatic headlines, describing the mummy as proof of a lost race. Photographs of the seated figure appeared in magazines, and people far from Wyoming marvelled at the strange discovery. Over time, the mummy became not only a scientific curiosity, but also a cultural icon, representing the possibility that the world still held secrets waiting to be uncovered. For those who visited exhibitions where the mummy was displayed, the experience often left a lasting impression. They described the figure as unsettling but strangely peaceful. Its leathery skin, the details of its face, the folded posture, it was both human and not human, familiar yet alien. Some visitors even left with a sense of unease, whispering that the tiny figure might be more than just a body. Perhaps it carried with it the spirit of the mountains. By the middle of the 20th century, the Pedro Mountains mummy had become part of American folklore. It was studied, photographed, and written about, yet no final answer was ever given. Was it simply a rare case of preservation, or was it evidence of something unknown? The mystery remained, carried forward by each new telling, and the little figure from the mountains continued to sit silently, as if guarding its own secret. By the 1940s, the Pedro Mountains mummy had already become more than an artifact. It was a riddle that seemed to resist every attempt at explanation. Scientists examined it with curiosity, collectors pursued it with eagerness, and ordinary people spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the tiny figure carried with it an unspoken warning. The mystery was no longer just about what the mummy was, but why it had been preserved in such a careful way. Sitting cross-legged, with its arms folded gently, it looked less like a body left to chance, and more like a figure placed intentionally, perhaps in ceremony or ritual. That posture alone set it apart from other preserved remains found in North America. Native American tribes had their own interpretations. Some elders spoke quietly about the Nemerigar, reminding listeners that these little beings were said to live underground and emerge only when necessary. In some stories they helped hunters or healed the sick, but in others they defended their lands fiercely, sometimes even attacking intruders. The discovery of the mummy seemed to support the older generation's warnings that legends often carried kernels of truth, yet outsiders, unfamiliar with those traditions, tended to treat the mummy as entertainment. Travelling exhibitions carried it from town to town, where curious audiences lined up to peer into the glass case. The figure, just over a foot tall, seemed impossibly delicate, its leathery skin clinging to the bones. Its face bore the appearance of age, with wrinkles around the mouth and eyes. To many observers it looked not like a child, but like a small wizened adult. That detail unsettled doctors and anthropologists alike. If it truly were an adult, how could its body be so tiny? Could it have belonged to a genetic group long vanished from history, or was it a medical anomaly preserved by chance? X-rays offered glimpses of bone structure, confirming that it was not a doll or a hoax. Inside the chest, ribs were visible, and the skull bore the clear features of a human head, but the proportions remained puzzling. The teeth, sharp and fully developed, did not match those of an infant. Still, skeptics held firm. Some suggested it was simply a stillborn child whose body had dried in the cave's air, creating the illusion of age. Others hinted at trickery, though no evidence of fabrication was ever uncovered. Over time, the mummy gained a reputation as both a marvel and a curse. Whispered stories spread that those who handled it too often faced misfortune, while others claimed dreams of the little figures followed them after visiting the display. Most dismissed these as superstition, yet the unease lingered. For decades, the Pedro Mountains mummy remained in the public eye, but slowly its trail grew faint. Ownership changed hands, exhibitions became less frequent, and eventually the mummy's whereabouts slipped into uncertainty. The mystery deepened, not only of what it was, but of where it had gone. As the decades passed, the Pedro Mountains mummy began to fade from newspapers, yet it never truly left the public imagination. Those who had once stood before its glass case carried the memory of its leathery face and folded posture for years afterward, often retelling the story to friends or children as if it were a ghostly tale from the frontier. By the 1950s, the mummy was no longer travelling in exhibitions, but instead came into the possession of private collectors. One such collector, a man named Ivan Goodman, took a particular interest in the little figure. He had heard of the legends, seen the photographs, and when the opportunity arose to acquire the mummy, he did so with pride. Goodman displayed it carefully, often inviting researchers and journalists to examine it, hoping to inspire further study. For a time, the Pedro mummy became part of his personal collection, yet he seemed to understand that what he owned was more than a curiosity. To him, it was a key to a story that had never been fully told. Scientists who visited Goodman remained divided. Some continued to argue that the mummy was an infant, its unusual features explained by a rare medical disorder. Others insisted the teeth, skull, and overall impression pointed to adulthood. The debate grew sharper, but still no conclusion was reached. Each explanation carried flaws. Each theory left questions hanging. Goodman, fascinated but cautious, often emphasized the respect owed to the figure. He claimed it deserved dignity, not mockery, and tried to keep the conversation around it serious. Yet even in his care, the mummy carried an aura of unease. Guests described a strange feeling when standing near it, a hush that seemed to settle over the room as though the air grew heavier. By the 1960s, Goodman's health declined, and with it came uncertainty about the mummy's fate. After his passing, ownership became murky. Rumours spread of the figure changing hands, moving quietly from one private collection to another. Some claimed it was stored away in a safe deposit box hidden from the world. Others whispered that it had been lost entirely, misplaced or stolen, vanishing into obscurity. Without photographs or public displays, its trail grew cold. Still, the memory of the Pedro Mountains mummy lived on in stories. Writers published articles revisiting the discovery. Historians reminded readers of the strange cave find, and native elders continued to speak of the Nemeragar. To them, the disappearance of the body did not erase its meaning. If anything, it reinforced the old belief that such beings were never meant to be captured or displayed. Instead, they belonged to the land, to the mountains that had hidden them for so long. And so, while the physical mummy may have slipped from sight, its legend grew ever stronger, carried forward by those who could not forget the tiny figure seated in eternal silence. By the 1970s, the Pedro Mountains mummy had transformed from a physical artifact into a true legend. Writers, radio hosts, and storytellers kept its memory alive, even as the actual body remained hidden from view. It was as if the mummy itself had retreated into the mountains once more, returning to secrecy while people were left with only whispers and speculation. In local libraries and dusty archives, photographs of the tiny figure circulated, showing its folded legs, leathery face, and sharp teeth. For those who had never seen it in person, these images were haunting enough to spark imagination. In Wyoming, children grew up hearing the story from parents and grandparents, who recalled the days when the mummy had been displayed in small exhibitions. These second-hand memories carried a kind of dreamlike quality, making the tale seem half real and half myth. At the same time, scientists continued to argue in journals and interviews. Some anthropologists pointed to conditions like an encephaly or hydrocephalus, which could have caused deformities in a fetus or infant. Yet the X-rays taken decades earlier showed fully formed bones and teeth, evidence that complicated the idea of simple abnormalities. A few even suggested that the mummy could represent an unknown population, perhaps related to early humans, though such theories were always controversial. Among Native American elders, the story retained spiritual weight. The Namerigar were never dismissed as fantasy within their traditions. To them, the mummy was not an oddity, but a sign that the ancient stories had truth at their core. Some spoke of the little people as healers who had withdrawn when the world grew too hostile. Others described them as fierce protectors of sacred places. In either version, the lesson was the same. These beings were not to be disturbed. The idea that the mummy had disappeared from public view seemed fitting to many elders. It was almost as though the land itself had reclaimed what belonged to it. Meanwhile, popular culture was beginning to pick up the story. Magazines dedicated to mysteries and unexplained phenomena began publishing articles with titles that promised readers a glimpse into America's Lost Race or The Secret of the Tiny Mummy. In these accounts, fact and folklore blended freely, painting the Pedro Mountains mummy as part of a global pattern of mysterious discoveries. To casual readers, the details mattered less than the wonder of imagining what lay hidden beneath the surface of the familiar world. By the late 1970s, the mummy had become a subject not only of anthropology, but of imagination. Some believed it proved that humanity's history was stranger than textbooks allowed. Others saw it as a curiosity that had slipped away, leaving behind only rumours and fading photographs. Yet no matter which view people held, the story endured, refusing to fade into silence. The mystery remained alive, not in museum halls, but in conversations, legends, and the quiet persistence of a question that had never been answered. Who was the tiny figure found in the Wyoming mountains, and why had it been seated in such solemn stillness? By the 1980s, the Pedro Mountains mummy existed mostly as a story passed from one voice to another. The actual remains were still missing from public view, yet the fascination surrounding them had not dimmed. In fact, absence seemed to make the tale stronger. Local newspapers occasionally revisited the story, often around Halloween or during features on regional mysteries. Each time, old photographs of the leathery, cross-legged figure would resurface, sending a quiet chill through readers who wondered how such a small body could appear so lifelike. Historians trying to trace the mummy's journey after the death of collector Ivan Goodman faced a fog of rumours. Some accounts suggested the figure had been placed in a safe deposit box in Casper. Others claimed it was shipped to New York and ended up in a private collection, vanishing from the West entirely. There were even whispers that it had been stolen, disappearing into the black market of curiosities. None of these stories were ever confirmed. This uncertainty only fueled speculation. For scientists, the case remained frustrating. Without access to the body, they could not perform modern testing. No DNA analysis, no carbon dating, nothing beyond the grainy X-rays taken decades earlier. Anthropologists argued in circles, repeating theories of congenital disorders, premature birth, or rare preservation. But without the mummy itself, they had no way to move the debate forward. For ordinary people, though, the scientific questions mattered less. What captured imaginations was the sense of something hidden, something waiting in the folds of time. The idea that a race of tiny people once lived among the Wyoming mountains connected easily with broader folklore around the world. Every culture seemed to have its own stories of little folk, elves, dwarves, fairies, or hidden tribes. The Pedro mummy became the American version of that timeless theme. Native elders continue to speak cautiously about the discovery. To them, the absence of the mummy was not a tragedy, but a correction. They believed such beings were never meant for display, never meant to sit behind glass in front of strangers. If it had vanished, perhaps it was simply returning to the earth, back into silence where it belonged. The 1980s also marked the rise of television programs exploring mysteries and legends. Occasionally, the Pedro Mountains mummy was mentioned in documentaries about the unexplained. Viewers across the nation saw flickering black and white photos of the tiny figure, often paired with dramatic narration about a lost race of pygmies, or a vanished tribe from America's distant past. These shows rarely provided new facts, but they ensured the story stayed alive in the cultural imagination. And so, the Pedro Mountains mummy lingered at the edge of memory, half history, half folklore, waiting for someone to rediscover it and bring its secrets into the light once more. By the 1990s, the Pedro Mountains mummy had taken on the shape of legend more than artifact. Its physical absence left room for the imagination to grow, and in that vacuum, speculation thrived. Articles in mystery magazines and small regional papers revisited the story, often with bold headlines promising answers that never came. Each piece would reprint the familiar photographs, the cross-legged figure, the leathery skin pulled tight over its bones, the sloping forehead and sharp teeth that seemed too adult for such a tiny frame. These images, though decades old, carried power. For those who had never heard the tale, they served as proof that something extraordinary had once been found in Wyoming. At the same time, a new generation of researchers was eager to examine the mummy with modern technology. By the 1990s, DNA analysis had become possible, and carbon dating was far more precise than the methods available in the 1930s. If the mummy could be located, science might finally provide clear answers. Was it an infant preserved in unusual conditions, an adult with genetic abnormalities, or evidence of a lost group of people who had lived unseen in the American mountains? Unfortunately, the trail was cold. Collectors who might have owned the mummy had either passed away or disappeared into obscurity. Families who inherited private collections often declined interviews, unwilling to admit what they had, or perhaps genuinely unaware of what lay in old trunks and boxes. Rumours persisted, though. Some said the mummy had been locked away in a bank vault in Wyoming, never to be touched again. Others claimed it had crossed the country, hidden in New York or Chicago. A few even suggested it had been destroyed, either by accident or intentionally to end the controversy. None of these stories were proven, and the truth remained frustratingly out of reach. Meanwhile, television specials about unsolved mysteries began to feature the Pedro mummy. Viewers across America watched reenactments of miners finding the tiny body in the cave, accompanied by dramatic music and deep narration. These shows rarely added new information, but they reminded audiences that the world still held unanswered questions. Among native communities, the story was treated with the same quiet caution as before. Elders repeated that the little people were real, that their presence should be respected, and that their remains were not meant to be disturbed. To them, the disappearance of the mummy was no mystery. It was balance. If something sacred had been taken, the earth would simply reclaim it. By the end of the 1990s, the Pedro Mountains mummy existed in two forms. One as fading photographs and reports tucked into archives, and the other as a living legend retold in whispers, classrooms, and late-night conversations. For those who believed, it was a reminder that not everything in human history could be neatly explained. And for skeptics, it remained an unsolved puzzle, waiting for the day when someone, somewhere, might uncover the truth once again. With the arrival of the 2000s, the Pedro Mountains mummy found a new life in the digital world. Stories that had once been confined to local newspapers and mystery magazines now spread quickly across online forums and early websites dedicated to the unexplained. People who had never set foot in Wyoming could suddenly read about the tiny figure and see the haunting photographs. The cross-legged posture, the leathery skin and the sharp teeth were enough to spark debates on message boards, filled with both skeptics and believers. Internet discussions often repeated the same questions that had followed the mummy for decades. Was it truly an adult preserved in miniature form, or just an infant altered by rare conditions? Did the discovery confirm the native legends of the Nimeragar, the little people who lived in the mountains? Or was it simply another case of mistaken interpretation, inflated by curiosity and myth? Online, the lack of physical access to the mummy did not matter. The very mystery of its disappearance made it more compelling. Without a definitive answer, every theory could thrive. Amateur researchers shared scans of the old X-rays, circling bones and teeth in grainy images to argue their points. Some leaned toward medical explanations, naming specific congenital disorders. Others insisted the mummy's adult-like features ruled out the idea of it being a child. The debate was lively, though it often led in circles. The internet also allowed global comparisons. Users pointed to legends of small people in other cultures, fairies in Europe, dwarves in Norse myths, or the Ebu Gogo said to exist in Indonesian folklore. The Pedro Mountains mummy was woven into this broader tapestry, a piece of worldwide fascination with hidden races and forgotten beings. Television documentaries in the early 2000s amplified this interest. Programs that focused on mysteries and ancient legends began to feature the Pedro story more frequently, pairing dramatic narration with computer animations of miners finding the mummy in the cave. These shows rarely produced new evidence, but they kept the legend alive for new generations of viewers. For Native American elders, the spread of the story online brought mixed feelings. On one hand, it ensured the old legends were not forgotten. On the other, it meant sacred stories were often stripped of their context, treated as entertainment rather than cultural heritage. Some elders warned that retelling the tale without respect could invite misfortune. Still, the internet era ensured that the Pedro mummy would never fully vanish. Even without the body itself, its image circulated endlessly, shared from one website to another. The little figure, seated in silence, became a symbol of mystery in a world that seemed increasingly explained by science. It reminded people that some questions linger stubbornly, resisting closure, inviting endless wonder. As the 2010s approached, professional researchers once again turned their attention to the Pedro Mountains mummy. With advancements in DNA testing and radiocarbon dating, scientists realized that if the body could be located, they might finally answer questions that had lingered for nearly a century. Yet the greatest obstacle remained the same. No one knew where the mummy actually was. Archives were searched, leads were followed, but every trail ended in speculation. Some believed it had been kept in a safety deposit box in Casper, but no official records confirmed this. Others claimed it was passed from Goodman's family into private hands, eventually sold quietly to collectors far from Wyoming. Without physical access, scientists were left only with the old X-rays and photographs. Those images were studied in detail once again. The X-rays clearly showed a spine, ribs, and a skull with adult-like proportions. The sharp teeth were visible, arranged in a way that seemed far too developed for an infant. Medical experts reviewing the images in the 2010s concluded that the mummy could not simply be explained as a premature child. At the same time, they cautioned against bold claims of a lost race. Without DNA, there could be no certainty. What intrigued modern researchers was the ritual-like posture. The cross-legged position, the folded arms, the slight forward tilt of the head. It suggested intentional placement. Whether by cultural practice or coincidence, the body did not appear randomly preserved. It looked arranged, as if someone long ago had chosen that posture carefully. For native elders, This detail reinforced their beliefs. They maintained that the Pedro mummy was not a curiosity but a spiritual being. Its posture mirrored traditions of meditation, ceremony, or sacred rest. To disturb it, they warned, was to disturb something beyond ordinary human understanding. While scientists pressed for evidence, writers and documentarians leaned into mystery. Articles appeared in popular magazines, blending fact with folklore, suggesting everything from medical anomalies to contact with hidden tribes. Online, the mummy's story became part of the wider fascination with cryptids and ancient mysteries. The tiny figure stood alongside tales of Bigfoot, giants, and lost civilizations. Yet unlike those, the Pedro mummy had photographs, X-rays, and eyewitness accounts, details that gave the legend unusual weight. By the end of the decade, the consensus was clear. The mummy existed, but its fate remained unknown. Somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten box or a collector's vault, it might still sit, silent and preserved. The thought was haunting, for it meant that a definitive answer was not impossible, merely hidden, waiting for rediscovery. In the 2020s, the Pedro Mountains mummy found a new audience through social media. Short videos, blog posts, and podcasts began to retell the strange tale, often using the haunting photographs to grab attention. A new generation, raised on streaming platforms and digital storytelling, encountered the legend not in newspapers or dusty books, but on glowing screens late at night. For many viewers, the story was brand new, and the reaction was the same as it had been nearly a century earlier. A mixture of wonder, disbelief, and quiet unease. Online creators debated the same old questions with fresh enthusiasm. Some argued that modern medicine would quickly prove it was an infant with severe abnormalities if the body were ever recovered. Others leaned into folklore, suggesting the mummy was proof of the Nemeragar, the little people of native legend. These videos and articles often blurred the line between science and myth, but they kept the discussion alive in a way that felt immediate and personal. Podcasts dedicated to mysteries featured long episodes about the mummy, exploring not just the discovery itself, but the cultural impact it had left behind. Listeners heard about the miners in the 1930s, the scientists divided by conflicting interpretations, the collectors who guarded the figure, and the unanswered question of where it might be today. Each retelling added another layer to the legend, ensuring it stayed vibrant in popular culture. For native communities, this renewed interest brought mixed emotions, much like before. Some saw it as an opportunity to remind outsiders that the Nemeragar were not myths, but part of living tradition. Others worried that the constant fascination reduced sacred stories into mere entertainment. The repeated use of the photographs, especially without context, felt disrespectful to some, as if the mummy were treated as a curiosity instead of a human being. Yet despite the disagreements, the story's reach widened. What had once been a local discovery in the Pedro Mountains was now known across the globe, translated into multiple languages, shared in countless online discussions. The absence of the physical body only deepened the allure. People are often most fascinated by mysteries that cannot be solved, and the mummy's disappearance kept it suspended in that space. In an age when science explains so much and information is available instantly, the Pedro mummy stood out as a reminder that the world still holds shadows. Whether it was an infant preserved by chance, an adult of extraordinary proportions, or a figure connected to legend, the mummy represented the unknown, and people everywhere still long for mysteries that defy easy answers. Comparisons between the Pedro Mountains mummy and other archaeological discoveries became more common as researchers and enthusiasts looked for patterns across the world. In South America, tiny mummified remains had been uncovered in the high deserts of Peru and Chile, preserved by dry air and salt-rich soils. Some of these were unquestionably children, wrapped carefully in burial cloths, their features delicate and unmistakably youthful. The Pedro mummy, by contrast, carried the impression of age, with wrinkled skin and sharp teeth that seemed far too developed for infancy. In Asia, tales of small-statured humans also surfaced in scientific discussions. The discovery of Homo floresiensis, a species of small-bodied humans found in Indonesia in 2003, gave new life to speculation about the Pedro mummy. Nicknamed the Hobbit, these individuals stood only about 3 feet tall as adults, yet were clearly part of the human family tree. Some enthusiasts pointed to this as evidence that tiny humans could exist in isolated regions, and perhaps the mummy was a relative or an echo of such populations. Scientists cautioned against jumping to conclusions, reminding the public that the Pedro mummy could not be studied directly. Still, the parallels fueled imagination. Folklore too offered intriguing links. Cultures across the globe preserved stories of little people living in hidden places, from Europe's fairies to the Menehune of Hawaii. The similarity of these tales suggested a universal human fascination with beings that were smaller, elusive, and often powerful in ways unseen. In this context, the Pedro mummy seemed less like an isolated curiosity, and more like a piece of a vast interconnected puzzle of human storytelling and discovery. For native elders, the comparisons meant little. They insisted that the Nimeragar were not myths, but specific to their own traditions and lands. To them, connecting the Pedro mummy to faraway discoveries was unnecessary. What mattered was the respect owed to the being, and the lesson carried in its appearance, that humans are not alone, and that the world holds more than we often acknowledge. The scientific community, however, remained intrigued by the possibility of a link. Anthropologists suggested that if DNA could ever be extracted, it might show whether the mummy was purely human or bore traces of a different lineage. Such testing, though, was impossible without the remains themselves, and so the Pedro Mountains mummy continued to hover between categories, part science, part legend, part unsolved question. The legends of the Nimeragar have always been central to the story of the Pedro Mountains mummy. Long before the miners broke into the cave in 1932, native tribes of the region spoke of little people who lived in the mountains and valleys. These beings were said to be small but strong, quick to defend their territory, and often feared for their ability to use poisoned arrows. Stories describe them as fierce warriors who could vanish into the rocks, appearing only when they wished to. Some traditions, however, painted a gentler picture, speaking of Nimeragar as healers with knowledge of herbs and medicine. In these tales, they were mysterious allies who occasionally helped humans in times of sickness or misfortune. The dual nature of the legends, both protective and dangerous, made the Nimeragar difficult to classify. They were not simple fairy tale figures, but complex beings woven into the landscape of belief. The discovery of the tiny mummy seemed to breathe new life into these stories. Elders pointed to the photographs and said that this was what had been spoken of for generations. The folded posture, the adult-like face, the sharp teeth, all of it matched details passed down through oral tradition. For native people, the Pedro mummy was less a puzzle than a reminder. The world still carried traces of truths that outsiders had long dismissed. Anthropologists often struggled with how to handle these accounts. On one hand, they recognized the cultural importance of the stories. On the other, they were trained to look for material explanations, seeking genetic disorders, natural preservation, or accidental mummification. Yet even the most skeptical researchers admitted that the physical body had features difficult to reconcile with the idea of a simple infant. The legends added pressure, suggesting that if the body did indeed connect to the Nimeragar, then it deserved respect as part of a living tradition, rather than as a mere artifact. Popular writers eagerly embraced the legends, blending them with the scientific mystery to create compelling narratives. Books and magazine features described the Pedro mummy as proof of the Nimeragar, ignoring the nuances of tribal tradition. While this brought the story to a wider audience, it also risked distorting its meaning, turning sacred lore into entertainment. For native elders, the true lesson of the Nimeragar was not simply that small beings existed, but that humans should remember humility. The mountains held secrets, and the land carried more than what the eye could see. Whether the Pedro mummy was truly one of these little people or not, its discovery reminded everyone of the depth of mystery still present in the world. When the Pedro Mountains mummy was first brought into the public eye in the 1930s, scientists wasted no time in trying to examine it. Doctors in Casper, Wyoming, were among the first to study the tiny figure, taking careful measurements of its height, skull shape, and posture. They noted that it sat upright, legs folded beneath it, with its arms resting calmly on its lap. The leathery skin and preserved features suggested natural mummification, likely caused by the dry cave air. But what caught their attention most were the details of the skull and teeth. The mummy's head was oddly shaped, with a low forehead and flattened nose. Inside its mouth were small but clearly developed teeth, sharp and pointed, not the soft gums of a newborn. To the doctors, this detail was alarming. Infants, even premature ones, do not have fully developed teeth. The presence of adult-like teeth suggested that the body might not be a child at all. To explore further, the researchers arranged for X-rays to be taken, a relatively advanced tool for the time. The images revealed a full skeleton beneath the leathery skin, with a spine, rib cage, and skull all intact. The bones were clearly human, yet their proportions were puzzling. The torso appeared fully formed, and the skull bore no obvious signs of being an incomplete fetus. If it were an infant, it had developed unusually far for its size. If it were an adult, it was impossibly small. Some doctors proposed explanations rooted in pathology. They suggested the body might belong to a child born with an encephaly, a condition where the brain and skull fail to fully develop. Others mentioned hydrocephalus, which can cause abnormal skull shapes. But these theories did not match all the evidence. The teeth were too mature, the bones too well formed, and the cross-legged posture seemed deliberate, as though the body had been placed carefully, not left to collapse naturally. Anthropologists who reviewed the case found themselves divided. Some leaned toward medical explanations, preferring not to accept the idea of a tiny adult. Others wondered if the body might represent a previously unknown cultural practice, perhaps a ritual involving deliberate preservation of unusual individuals. The photographs published in newspapers only deepened public fascination. People across the country wrote letters, offering their own theories, ranging from lost tribes to ancient curses. For scientists, however, the mummy remained an unresolved anomaly. Without more advanced tools, they could not go beyond observation and speculation. Yet even in its earlier studies, the Pedro Mountains mummy resisted simple answers. It was human, yes, but in what way remained uncertain. The press quickly recognized the Pedro Mountains mummy as the perfect story for a curious public. In the early 1930s, newspapers thrived on tales that blended frontier adventure with mystery, and the discovery in Wyoming fit both categories perfectly. Within weeks of the find, headlines appeared across the state and soon spread to other parts of the country. Articles carried dramatic titles such as "Tiny Man Found in Cave" or "Mystery Mummy Unearthed in Mountains." Photographs of the little figure were printed, showing its cross-legged posture and leathery skin. For many readers, the images were shocking. The body looked both real and unreal, a miniature human preserved in a way that defied easy explanation. Reporters leaned into the sense of the uncanny. They described the mummy's sharp teeth, its sloping forehead, and the impression that it was not a baby but a fully grown adult. Some accounts went further, linking the discovery to native legends of little people, suggesting that science had stumbled onto proof of ancient stories. The result was a wave of fascination. People wrote letters to editors asking where they could see the mummy, or demanding that scientists provide an official answer. Public exhibitions drew crowds. In small towns, families lined up to view the figure through a glass case, whispering as they studied the strange face frozen in silence. Children clutched their parents' hands, unsure whether to be afraid or amazed. Newspapers kept the excitement alive by publishing follow-up pieces. They interviewed doctors who had studied the remains, often highlighting their disagreements. One article might quote a physician calling it a malformed infant, while another quoted an expert insisting it was an adult of tiny stature. The lack of consensus only deepened the intrigue. For the press, the conflicting views were not a problem. They were a gift. The more uncertainty surrounded the mummy, the more readers wanted to know. Beyond Wyoming, the story spread nationally through magazines dedicated to mysteries and human oddities. The Pedro mummy was soon placed alongside tales of strange archaeological finds, unexplained skeletons, and lost civilizations. It became part of a larger cultural appetite for the unusual, the kind of story that reminded people the world was not yet fully mapped or explained. In this way, the media transformed the discovery from a local curiosity into a national legend. What began with two miners breaking into a cave had grown into one of America's most enduring mysteries, fueled not only by science, but by the power of words, photographs, and the endless curiosity of the public. For those who saw the Pedro Mountains mummy in person, the memory often stayed with them for a lifetime. Visitors to small-town exhibitions described the same quiet awe that seemed to fall over every room where the tiny figure was displayed. People expected to feel curiosity, but what many remembered most was an unsettling sense of reverence, as if they were standing before something that demanded silence. The mummy was small enough to fit into a child's arms, yet its presence felt heavy, almost commanding. Witnesses recalled leaning close to the glass and noticing the details, the leathery folds of skin, the deep-set eyes closed forever, and above all the sharp little teeth that gave the impression of age. Some swore the face looked like that of an elderly man, lined with wrinkles, though others insisted it seemed more like a child with features distorted by preservation. These disagreements only fueled the mystery. Parents told their children that they were lucky to witness such a rare sight, though the younger ones often admitted feeling uneasy afterward. A few even spoke of dreams in which the mummy appeared, seated as it had been in the cave, watching silently. Though such stories could be dismissed as imagination, they became part of the legend passed along in kitchens and classrooms across Wyoming. Travellers who encountered the mummy while passing through the region often carried the story back home, spreading its fame beyond the state. Their accounts, published in letters or retold around dinner tables, often emphasized the same theme. This was no hoax, no doll, but a real human body unlike anything they had ever seen. Some witnesses believed it proved the truth of native legends. Others thought it was evidence of a forgotten culture or a strange scientific anomaly. Still, all agreed it was unforgettable. In later years, when journalists sought interviews with those who had seen the mummy decades earlier, the details remained vivid in their minds. One man recalled how the room had fallen quiet as soon as the figure was unveiled, as though everyone instinctively understood they were looking at something rare. A woman remembered her father whispering that they should not stare too long, out of respect. These recollections, carried across generations, gave the Pedro mummy a life far beyond its physical form. Even after the body itself disappeared from public view, the stories of those who had seen it kept the mystery alive. Each witness added a thread to the tapestry, and together their voices ensured that the legend of the tiny mummy would never fade completely. As the legend of the Pedro Mountains mummy grew, whispers of curses and strange coincidences began to surround it. Stories spread quietly, usually retold by locals who had heard them second-hand. Some claim that miners who first uncovered the mummy faced misfortune in the years that followed, as if disturbing the tiny figure had brought them bad luck. Others spoke of collectors who possessed the mummy for a time, and later experienced financial troubles, accidents, or sudden illnesses. Though none of these tales were documented in official records, they became part of the folklore that clung to the mummy like a shadow. In many ways, such stories were inevitable. The idea of a mysterious body unearthed from a hidden cave carried with it an air of danger. Throughout history, discoveries of ancient remains have often been linked to tales of curses, from the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs to native burial grounds. The Pedro mummy, sitting cross-legged with its silent, aged face, fit neatly into this pattern. Visitors who viewed it sometimes remarked that they felt watched, or that the room grew colder as they stood near the glass case. A few even claimed to have dreams of little figures chasing them through rocky landscapes, arrows in hand. Whether real experiences or products of suggestion, these accounts gave the mummy a reputation that went beyond science. The sense of unease was amplified by its disappearance. When the mummy slipped from public view, people speculated that perhaps it had been hidden deliberately, not just to keep it safe, but to prevent further harm. Some elders nodded at these rumours, insisting that sacred beings should never be treated as spectacles. If the Pedro mummy carried power, then disturbing it might indeed invite consequences. At the same time, skeptics argued that such stories were nothing more than folklore layered on top of an already mysterious discovery. To them, the idea of a curse was a way for people to explain misfortune, attaching meaning to coincidence. Still, even those who dismissed the tales admitted that the mummy's presence seemed unusual. Something about its posture and expression left an impression that was difficult to shake. In small communities, these stories grew with each retelling. A mishap in the mountains, a sudden illness, or even a lost fortune could be linked back to the mummy in whispers. Whether true or not, the legend of a curse only deepened the mystery. The Pedro Mountains. Mummy was no longer just a scientific puzzle or a cultural artifact. It had become a figure of power in people's imaginations, an object of fear, respect, and endless speculation. By the middle of the 20th century, professional researchers began to realize how quickly the Pedro Mountains mummy was slipping out of their reach. The body had moved from miners to showmen, then into the hands of private collectors. Each transfer made its trail harder to follow, and each new owner seemed less willing to allow serious study. Anthropologists and medical experts who had once examined it urged for preservation in a museum, but that never happened. Instead, the mummy drifted into obscurity, passed from display cases into private rooms where only a few were allowed to see it. Several attempts were made to track its whereabouts. In the 1950s, rumours suggested it had been stored in a safe deposit box in Casper. In the 1960s, others claimed it had been transported east, perhaps to New York, where wealthy collectors kept curiosities hidden away. Later whispers spoke of it vanishing altogether, lost in the shuffle of estates when owners passed away. Each theory sounded possible, but none were confirmed. Journalists who tried to investigate often found themselves chasing shadows. When they approached families of collectors, the responses were vague, sometimes dismissive, sometimes defensive. It was difficult to tell whether people were hiding something or whether they truly knew nothing about the mummy's fate. Without the physical remains, scientific progress stalled. The X-rays taken decades earlier were all that researchers had to work with, and though they offered intriguing clues, they could not provide definitive answers. Anthropologists debated endlessly over the shape of the skull, the presence of adult teeth, and the proportions of the bones. Yet without new evidence, the arguments went in circles. The loss of the mummy became almost as fascinating as its discovery. Some believed it was intentionally hidden, kept away from public eyes because it carried power or danger. Others thought it might have been destroyed, either accidentally or deliberately, to avoid controversy. A few optimists held on to the hope that it still existed, carefully preserved in a vault, waiting for rediscovery. The uncertainty gave the story new energy. The Pedro Mountains mummy was no longer just a strange body found in a cave. It was now also a mystery of disappearance. Its vanishing raised as many questions as its existence. Where had it gone? Who had last seen it? Could it still be recovered? For scientists, the answers mattered because of what they could reveal about human history. For the public, the questions mattered because they kept the story alive. And in the quiet spaces between fact and rumour, the legend of the mummy continued to grow. By the late 20th century, efforts to trace the Pedro Mountains mummy had become almost like detective work. Historians, journalists, and amateur researchers combed through archives, searching for paperwork, photographs, or personal notes that might reveal where the mummy had gone. Estate sales were quietly investigated, and letters from collectors were read with care, but the trail remained stubbornly faint. One of the clearest points of certainty was its time in the hands of Ivan Goodman, the businessman who had proudly displayed it for years. After his death in the early 1950s, records became murky. Some claim the mummy passed into the custody of a New York collector who specialized in rare oddities. Others insisted it never left Wyoming and was instead secured in a safety deposit box, hidden from curious eyes. Despite repeated searches, no one ever produced proof. In the 1970s and 1980s, renewed interest in unexplained phenomena led several writers to dig into the case again. They interviewed surviving family members of those who had once handled the mummy, but answers were vague and often contradictory. A few insisted they remembered seeing it tucked carefully in a private collection. Others shrugged and admitted they had no idea what had happened after Goodman's passing. The inconsistencies only deepened the mystery. By the 1990s, researchers hoped the growth of public databases and digitized archives might help. Old newspapers were scanned, photographs catalogued, and genealogies traced. A handful of forgotten images of the mummy surfaced in local collections, showing it from slightly different angles than before. While these photographs did not solve the riddle, they reminded the public that the mummy had once been real, seated in its strange meditative posture. The lack of physical evidence frustrated scientists but enchanted storytellers. For the general public, the disappearance added another layer of intrigue. It was one thing to wonder what the mummy had been in life. It was another to wonder where it had gone in death. Some speculated that secrecy was intentional, that owners feared backlash from native tribes or worried about ridicule from academics. Others whispered darker possibilities, suggesting the mummy had been deliberately destroyed to erase uncomfortable questions. Still, a small group of optimists believed it was out there, resting quietly in some forgotten drawer or vault, waiting to be rediscovered. Each attempt to find it kept the legend alive, even when it ended in disappointment. By the turn of the century, the Pedro Mountains mummy was no longer just an archaeological puzzle. It was also a missing treasure, one that symbolized how fragile mysteries can be when they depend on fragile human chains of custody. In the early years of the 21st century, the Pedro Mountains mummy began to surface once again in popular culture. Books dedicated to unsolved mysteries included chapters about it, often pairing the story with tales of vanished civilizations, strange fossils, and unexplained artifacts. Television channels that specialized in history and science began airing programs that featured short segments about the mummy, usually accompanied by reenactments of the miners breaking into the cave. These shows rarely provided new evidence, but they kept the legend alive for audiences who had never heard of the discovery. Viewers were struck by the photographs shown on screen. The tiny figure seated cross-legged, with its leathery skin and strangely mature features. The narrator's voice would often pose the same questions that had haunted scientists for decades. Was it a malformed infant, an unknown species, or perhaps proof of Native American legends? The lack of clear answers made the story all the more captivating. Writers of popular books leaned heavily on this uncertainty. Some authors favoured scientific explanations, carefully reviewing the old X-rays and proposing medical conditions that might explain the body's size and shape. Others preferred a more sensational approach, presenting the mummy as evidence of a lost race of tiny people who once inhabited the American West. These contrasting views mirrored the divide that had always existed between academic caution and public imagination. Meanwhile, local communities in Wyoming continued to regard the story with quiet pride. The mummy had become part of regional identity, a mystery rooted in their own mountains and deserts. Tourists who passed through often asked about it, and guides sometimes pointed to the Pedro Range as the place where the little man had been found. For native elders, the resurgence of interest was both expected and troubling. They warned that fascination with the mummy could lead people to treat sacred traditions as entertainment. The Nimeragar, they reminded outsiders, were not myths but part of cultural memory, deserving respect rather than spectacle. Still, the renewed attention gave them an opportunity to retell their stories to wider audiences, reminding people that the land itself carried mysteries beyond written history. By the mid-2000s, the Pedro Mountains mummy had secured a firm place in the growing category of enduring mysteries. It was discussed in classrooms, featured in documentaries, and debated online. And while no one had yet rediscovered the body itself, the absence seemed to strengthen the allure. The little mummy of Wyoming remained unseen, but its legend was more visible than ever. As the internet matured in the 2010s, the Pedro Mountains mummy became a frequent subject of online communities dedicated to mysteries and folklore. On forums and later on social media, users shared the familiar black and white photographs, debating endlessly about what the tiny figure truly represented. Some threads focused on science, bringing up medical conditions that could have explained the unusual features. Others leaned toward folklore, linking the mummy to legends of the Nemeragar, or even to global traditions of little people. The diversity of voices gave the story a new energy, as everyday people joined scholars, skeptics, and believers in the discussion. Amateur researchers dug through digitized archives, posting old newspaper clippings that had long been forgotten. They highlighted the dramatic language reporters once used, describing the mummy as wizened and ancient despite its small size. Others analysed the X-ray images with modern knowledge, pointing out details that earlier scientists might have overlooked. For example, some argued that the jaw structure looked fully adult, while others countered that premature infants could sometimes develop teeth earlier than expected. These debates rarely reached consensus, but they kept the mummy in public view. YouTube videos and podcasts also contributed to the spread of the legend. Creators uploaded short documentaries, often combining historic photographs with eerie music and narration. These productions emphasized the mystery rather than the science, presenting the Pedro mummy as a puzzle that defied explanation. Viewers from around the world encountered the story this way, many of them hearing about it for the first time. Each video sparked new waves of curiosity, sending people searching for more information. For Wyoming locals, the sudden attention from international audiences was both surprising and affirming. The Pedro mummy was no longer just a regional oddity. It had become part of a global conversation about unexplained history. In classrooms, teachers used it as an example of how folklore and archaeology can intersect. In casual conversations online, it appeared alongside discussions of Bigfoot, Atlantis, and other enduring enigmas. Native voices also appeared in these discussions, often reminding outsiders that the story was not just about curiosity but about respect. Elders repeated that the little people of legend were real within their traditions, and that the mummy should never have been disturbed in the first place. Their warnings added depth to the conversation, reminding listeners that behind every mystery artifact are real cultural beliefs. By the end of the decade, the Pedro Mountains mummy had become firmly rooted in the digital landscape. Whether approached as science, folklore, or entertainment, it was a story that refused to fade, sustained by thousands of voices across the world who found in it a reminder that not every secret has been solved. Professional archaeologists and historians often compared the Pedro Mountains mummy with other mysterious remains discovered around the world. These comparisons were not meant to prove a connection, but to explore how unusual finds challenge the boundaries of accepted knowledge. One of the most frequent parallels was drawn with the discovery of Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, nicknamed the Hobbit. These small-bodied humans stood barely over 3 feet tall, yet they lived tens of thousands of years ago and were clearly part of the human lineage. For many, this proved that tiny humans could and did exist, raising the possibility that the Pedro mummy might represent something more than a medical anomaly. In South America, naturally preserved mummies of children had been uncovered in the Andes, where cold and dry conditions allowed for remarkable preservation. Yet even those, often wrapped in ceremonial cloth, looked unmistakably childlike. The Pedro mummy was different. Its sharp teeth and wrinkled face gave it the appearance of an adult, even though it measured no more than 18 inches in height. Historians also pointed to ancient European folklore about little people, fairies, dwarves, and hidden folk. Though these tales were usually dismissed as myth, they showed how widespread the human imagination was when it came to beings smaller than ourselves. Could such myths have been inspired by rare encounters with unusual individuals or preserved remains? Some researchers thought so, though others warned against confusing legend with evidence. Native American elders insisted that outsiders did not need to search the globe for parallels. The Nimeragar were specific to their own traditions, tied to the land and the mountains where the mummy was found. To them, the Pedro mummy was not part of a global mystery, but part of a local truth that outsiders had ignored for too long. For scientists, the comparisons highlighted the frustrating gap left by the mummy's disappearance. If DNA could be tested, perhaps it would confirm whether the body was a child, an adult, or even part of a previously unknown group of humans. Without the remains, however, all comparisons stayed in the realm of speculation. And yet, these global links gave the Pedro story new life. Writers included it in books about lost civilizations, television shows paired it with discoveries from distant continents, and online forums debated whether humanity's past might hold more diversity than we realize. Each new comparison kept the Wyoming mummy in the spotlight, reminding people that mysteries are rarely isolated. They echo across cultures, histories, and imaginations. Skeptics of the Pedro Mountains, mummy never denied that the figure had been real. They acknowledged the photographs, the X-rays, and the eyewitness reports. What they questioned was the interpretation. For them, the most logical explanation was that the mummy represented a human infant, preserved by unusual conditions in the cave. They pointed to the fact that natural mummification can sometimes produce effects that make bodies appear older than they are. Skin shrinks, features distort, and small details take on exaggerated appearances. In the case of the Pedro mummy, skeptics argued that the leathery folds of skin and the sharp-looking teeth were simply artifacts of preservation, not signs of adulthood. Medical experts suggested congenital disorders as further explanations. Anencephaly, where parts of the skull and brain do not fully develop, was often cited. This condition could result in a sloping forehead and abnormal head shape, similar to what was observed in the mummy. Others mentioned hydrocephalus, which causes swelling of the skull. Premature birth combined with these conditions, they argued, could have produced a body that looked unusual even before preservation. The presence of teeth remained the strongest point against the infant theory, yet skeptics countered that some newborns are born with teeth, a rare condition known as neonatal teeth. While uncommon, it was not impossible, and skeptics leaned on this explanation to maintain their case. They also reminded audiences that small mummified remains are not rare worldwide. In dry caves, deserts, or high mountains, bodies have been preserved naturally for centuries. What made the Pedro mummy unique, they said, was not its size, but the myths that grew around it. For skeptics, folklore and sensational journalism had taken a simple case of natural preservation and transformed it into a legend of little people. They argued that human imagination had filled in the gaps left by science. Even the posture, skeptics claimed, could be explained by natural processes. As the body dried, muscles contracted, and the limbs folded into positions that might appear intentional. What looked like ritual placement could, in their view, be nothing more than the result of nature taking its course. Despite these arguments, skeptics admitted frustration at the lack of access to the actual remains. Without DNA testing or modern medical analysis, their explanations remained theories rather than proven facts. Yet they stood firm in their belief. The Pedro mummy did not represent a lost race or proof of folklore. It was, in their eyes, a tragic but ordinary child, preserved in extraordinary conditions and magnified into mystery by time, legend, and human curiosity. Believers in the more mysterious explanations of the Pedro Mountains, mummy argued passionately against the skeptical view. For them, the figure's details could not be dismissed as the result of premature birth or congenital disorders. They pointed especially to the sharp, fully formed teeth, which seemed far too developed for an infant. The face, they said, bore the marks of age. Wrinkled skin around the mouth and eyes, features that suggested maturity rather than infancy. To those who held this perspective, the mummy represented something far more profound than a medical anomaly. Many connected the mummy directly to the native legends of the Nimeragar. They believed the Pedro mummy was physical proof that these little people had truly existed in the Wyoming mountains. The stories described them as small but powerful, capable of both healing and harm, and the discovery of a tiny body seemed to confirm what had been passed down for generations. Some storytellers went further, suggesting that the Nimeragar might have been a distinct race of humans, now vanished but once coexisting with larger tribes. Supporters of this theory pointed to parallels around the world. The discovery of Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, a species of small-bodied humans that lived thousands of years ago, provided evidence that miniature humans were not only possible but historically real. If they could exist in one part of the world, why not in North America? For these believers, the Pedro mummy was a tantalizing clue that humanity's past held more diversity than textbooks revealed. Others proposed that the figure might represent a ritual or spiritual practice. Its cross-legged posture seemed deliberate, almost meditative, as though it had been positioned with care. This raised questions. Had the Nimeragar or another unknown group buried their dead in ceremonial ways? Was the Pedro mummy not just a body, but a sign of cultural practice now lost to time? Popular authors and documentary makers embraced these ideas. They described the mummy as a remnant of a forgotten world, a bridge between legend and archaeology. In their accounts, the Pedro Mountains were portrayed as a place of hidden history, a landscape where secrets still lingered in caves and ridges. Believers found hope in these portrayals, convinced that the world still held mysteries waiting to be revealed. For them, the Pedro mummy was not a hoax, not a malformed infant, but a messenger from the past, silent, enduring, and powerful in its ability to challenge what we think we know. The disappearance of the Pedro Mountains mummy only deepened the sense of mystery that surrounded it. When it was first displayed in the 1930s and 1940s, anyone could line up, peer through the glass, and walk away with their own impression. But once the mummy slipped into private hands, the public lost its only direct link to the discovery. Over time, the absence became as fascinating as the mummy itself. People began to wonder why such an unusual find had vanished. Some believed it was simply lost in the shuffle of estates and collections, forgotten in a box or hidden in a vault where no one realized its significance. Others suspected something more deliberate, that it had been concealed to prevent further study, or perhaps to protect cultural sensitivities. The lack of clarity created endless room for speculation. Folklore filled the gaps that facts could not. Stories emerged that the mummy had been stolen, spirited away by collectors who feared it might be claimed by a museum. Others whispered that it had been destroyed, either by accident or to erase a controversy that had grown too large. Still others claimed it had been returned to the mountains in secret, reburied to restore balance after being taken from its resting place. Each version of the story carried its own weight, and none could be disproven. For scientists, the disappearance was a source of frustration. Modern tools such as DNA sequencing and carbon dating could have provided answers to questions that had lingered for decades. Without the body, however, every theory remained speculation. For believers, the disappearance was proof of the mummy's importance. If it had truly been ordinary, they argued, it would not have simply vanished. Its absence to them suggested that it carried truths too disruptive to be easily explained. For native elders, the disappearance was perhaps the most fitting end of all. They said that the mummy had returned to where it belonged, beyond the reach of curious eyes and careless hands. To them, it was a reminder that sacred things are not meant to be displayed or dissected. The mummy's story had travelled far enough. Its spirit had gone back to rest. In the wider culture, the mystery of its vanishing gave the Pedro mummy a second life. It was no longer just an unusual archaeological discovery. It was now a lost treasure, a hidden relic, a ghost of history. The combination of its strange appearance and its unexplained disappearance turned it into one of America's enduring legends, a story that remained alive precisely because it could never be concluded. In recent years, researchers and enthusiasts have continued searching for any trace of the Pedro Mountains mummy. Some efforts have been academic, led by historians and anthropologists who hoped that forgotten documents or overlooked photographs might still be hiding in archives. Others have been more personal, driven by curiosity and fascination rather than formal study. Together, these attempts created a patchwork of investigations, each chasing the shadow of the missing figure. Local historical societies in Wyoming have preserved newspaper clippings, photographs, and even letters that mention the mummy. Volunteers have carefully scanned these materials, uploading them to digital collections where anyone can access them. While the physical body remains absent, these archives ensure the mummy is not forgotten. For researchers, even a grainy photograph can offer clues about posture, proportions, or context that earlier generations might have missed. Private collectors have also been quietly questioned. Some are said to own unusual relics from the early 20th century, but none have confirmed possessing the Pedro mummy. The secrecy of the collecting world makes the search difficult. Artifacts often pass through hands without formal records, disappearing into basements, safes, or estate auctions. Still, every rumour sparks hope that the mummy might one day resurface. Technology has given enthusiasts new tools. Online forums allow people to share discoveries instantly, and digital archives connect researchers to sources across the world. Amateur sleuths have tracked old exhibition posters, traced family trees of former owners, and compared photographs to other known artifacts. Though no breakthrough has come, these efforts show how enduring the fascination remains. Native communities have watched these searches with mixed feelings. Some elders have reminded researchers that the mummy's disappearance may have been intentional, that it was meant to rest once more in the mountains. Others encourage respectful inquiry, suggesting that the story still carries lessons for future generations. In either case, they stress that the mummy should be remembered with dignity, not as a spectacle. Despite the challenges, the search continues. Each unanswered question keeps interest alive, and each rumour offers a spark of possibility. The idea that the Pedro Mountains mummy could still exist, hidden somewhere in a vault or private collection, is enough to drive new generations to keep looking. Whether or not it is ever found, the pursuit itself has become part of the legend, a reminder that mysteries are not only about what we discover, but also about how we choose to seek the truth. The influence of the Pedro Mountains mummy has reached far beyond archaeology and folklore, spilling into culture, art, and collective imagination. Writers have drawn inspiration from the story for decades, weaving it into novels, short stories, and essays that explore the blurred line between myth and history. Some portray the mummy as a relic of a lost tribe, while others use it as a symbol of mystery that refuses to be solved. In art, the tiny figure has inspired painters and sculptors who see in its cross-legged posture a sense of calm resilience, as though it carries secrets too old to be spoken aloud. Museums that do not even possess the mummy itself have used its story as part of exhibits about mysteries of the American West, placing it alongside tales of vanished towns, ghost sightings, and strange geological formations. The mummy's image, dark eyes closed, leathery skin stretched across bones, teeth faintly visible, has become an icon of the unexplained. In popular culture, it appears in television episodes, online documentaries, and even comic books. The internet age has turned the mummy into a meme of sorts, not in a humorous way, but as a recurring symbol of hidden history. Every few years, a new wave of fascination rises, sparked by a documentary, a podcast, or a viral post that revisits the old photographs. Each time, new audiences discover the story, and the cycle of wonder begins again. For locals in Wyoming, the Pedro mummy is part of regional identity. It represents the idea that their rugged mountains hold more than gold or minerals. They hold secrets of the past that defy simple explanation. Teachers sometimes include the tale in lessons about folklore, encouraging students to think about how stories grow and change over time. In this way, the mummy continues to educate as much as it fascinates. For native communities, the cultural impact is more complex. Some view the renewed attention as a chance to remind the world of their traditions, to assert that the Nimeragar were always part of their heritage. Others worry that the constant retelling strips away sacred meaning, reducing powerful stories to entertainment. Both perspectives coexist, shaping the way the mummy is remembered. Ultimately, the Pedro Mountains mummy has become more than a physical object. It has become a story that adapts to each generation. It is told as legend, studied as anomaly, and celebrated as a symbol of the unknown. Its influence on culture proves that sometimes the greatest power of a discovery lies not in answers, but in the questions it leaves behind. Today, the Pedro Mountains mummy continues to live on as both legend and local identity. In Wyoming, tour guides sometimes mention the story when driving visitors past the Pedro Range, pointing toward the rugged hills where miners once broke into the hidden cave. Travellers are fascinated by the thought that somewhere in those mountains, a secret once lay undisturbed for centuries. Small museums in the region, though they do not possess the mummy, often include displays about it. Photographs, clippings, and replicas that keep the memory alive for tourists eager to glimpse a piece of the mystery. Some local shops even sell postcards or trinkets that reference the tiny mummy of Wyoming, blending folklore with commerce. Beyond Wyoming, the story circulates constantly in podcasts, online articles, and short videos. Each retelling brings the old photographs to new audiences who encounter them with fresh curiosity. In a world saturated with information, the Pedro mummy stands out precisely because it resists easy answers. Unlike so many mysteries solved by science, this one remains suspended in uncertainty, and that makes it magnetic. Tourists who hear about it sometimes plan side trips, hoping to find traces of the cave where it was discovered, though its exact location has long been lost to time. Enthusiasts who study regional folklore travel to Wyoming to speak with locals, gathering oral histories that connect the mummy to the broader fabric of legend. In this way, the story continues to draw people into the landscape where it began. For native communities, the ongoing fascination has a double edge. On one hand, it keeps their traditions alive in the global imagination, reminding outsiders that their ancestors spoke of the Nimeragar long before miners uncovered the tiny figure. On the other hand, it risks turning sacred stories into curiosities. Elders stress that the real meaning lies not in spectacle, but in respect, that the mummy should be remembered as part of a larger spiritual truth about the land and its hidden powers. Despite these cautions, the mummy's legend remains a source of wonder. It draws together science, folklore, tourism, and storytelling in a way that few mysteries manage to do. For some, it is a riddle waiting to be solved with DNA tests and modern equipment. For others, it is a reminder that some secrets are meant to endure, echoing in the spaces between mountains and memories. In both cases, the Pedro Mountains mummy continues to hold its quiet power, shaping the imagination of those who hear its story even nearly a century after its discovery. Nearly a century has passed since two miners broke into a small cave in Wyoming and came face to face with the tiny cross-legged figure that would become the Pedro Mountains mummy. In that time, countless theories have risen and fallen, each attempting to explain what the mummy truly was. Scientists have leaned toward medical anomalies and natural preservation, while storytellers and believers have linked it to the enduring legends of the Nimeragar. Yet despite all the speculation, no single answer has ever taken hold. The disappearance of the body itself ensured that the mystery would remain unsolved. Without DNA tests, without carbon dating, the debate remains frozen in time, much like the mummy itself once was. And perhaps that is why the story still feels alive. Mysteries often fade once they are explained, but the Pedro mummy continues to rest in the shadowy space between science and legend. For native elders, the lesson has always been clear. The mummy was never meant to be displayed or dissected. It was a reminder of the unseen world, a sign of respect for traditions that stretch back beyond written history. To them, its disappearance was not a loss, but a restoration, a return of balance after something sacred had been disturbed. For scientists, the unresolved questions remain a challenge, a puzzle that could one day be solved if the body ever reappears. And for the wider public, the story is simply captivating. A quiet reminder that even in a modern world of satellites and endless information, some mysteries remain untouched. Today, the Pedro Mountains mummy lives on in photographs, in articles, and in the voices of those who retell the legend. Travellers still glance toward the Wyoming mountains and wonder what secrets might lie beneath the rocks. Children hear the story and imagine little people watching from the hillsides. Writers and artists continue to draw inspiration from its silence, seeing in the mummy not just a body but a symbol of the unknown. Perhaps one day the mummy will be found again, and science will finally offer clarity. Or perhaps it will never return, leaving only its legend to echo through time. Either way, its impact endures. The Pedro Mountains mummy reminds us that the world is larger than our explanations, that some questions do not need answers to be powerful. And so the story ends as it began, with a tiny figure seated in silence, watching over the centuries, holding a secret it may never share.